So I'd like to welcome Paul Quinlan to talk about rural Tultera trees.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Paul Quinlan tāko ingoa, e noho ana hau ke kaio, I te tau whakarau. I'm a landscape architect based in the far north, and this presentation, it outlines an effort to bring about appropriate and sustainable rural land use based on native forestry. It's a story of a collaborative effort by a team of people and agencies, all trying to respond appropriately to the pressing crises of our times: climate change, biodiversity and fresh water. The motivation is to try and reconcile our land use activities with nature and with our future and our cultural well-being. This is not a story of design or planning, but it is a story about trying to bring about change and to shape and create a better rural landscape outcome. This presentation will focus on the initiatives of the Northland Tultera Working Group, which is only one strand of a much bigger campaign by Tāne's Tree Trust and others to promote the establishment and the management of locally appropriate native forests for multiple purposes throughout the country. The Tultera Working Group started in 2005 to support research into the productive use of naturally regenerating Tultera on private land. And while timber production has been a primary focus, it's really the non-timber values and the benefits that come along with native forest cover that is the compelling agenda. These include increasing biodiversity, carbon sequestration, erosion control and soil and water quality, riparian management, social and cultural values, including employment and landscape and amenity values. And therefore it's the vision of this group that aligns very well with broader policy goals that are seeking innovative, sustainable land management practices. And it's for those reasons that the group and its projects have had support from organisations like the New Zealand Land Care Trust, and the projects have been funded by the Sustainable Farming Fund, Reconnecting Northland and the Provincial Growth Fund. Now, some people may balk at the idea of cutting down any native trees, and nowadays it's almost sacrilege to suggest the commercial use of native trees or native forests. And native logging certainly has terrible connotations from the past exploitation. And this has led to a separation in our landscape between production and conservation. It's production here and conservation over there. And however, this also has led to quite a preservationist approach to native trees on private rural land. We're finding this approach is increasingly sort of an inadequate approach and often leads to perverse outcomes. Academic David Hall describes this current situation in terms of land use as the siloed world, when we really need to be moving to the interwoven world, as he calls it, which is multifunctional land uses, an integrated landscape. For many reasons, landowners are increasingly being asked to integrate more native trees into their working lands. However, this is also the space in which they require to do their business. And in Northland, Tultera are so common on farms that many pastoral farmers view them as weeds. But they are often used for livestock shade and shelter, erosion control and aesthetics, but there's a limit to those needs. And many landowners see no economic value in the regenerating scrub cover on their land. In fact, they're terrified that they'll have an SNA slapped on it, which will limit their potential land use options. Clearance occurs often purely out of fear. We think it would be much better to try and work with this natural process of regeneration. and our studies have shown that regenerating Tultera has excellent potential for sustainable management on Northland farms. Indeed, the species is very well suited to that purpose. Tultera is a remarkable timber species. It's a pioneer tree species. It's ecologically suited to disturbance environments such as what has been created by land clearance and farming. It's stock resistant. It succeeds in a grazed environment. There's abundant natural regeneration. It responds very well to silviculture, and it has excellent potential for sustainable management, particularly with continuous cover forestry practices. And importantly, it's a significantly scaled resource, which is important for any commercial mass. It occurs throughout the country. Therefore, Tultera brings a unique and a very practical opportunity to integrate a native tree species into the pastoral environment. In fact, it's already an ingrained part of Northland's landscape character. Regenerating Tultera could create an expanding matrix of native tree cover. And I'll just give a whirlwind overview of the life cycle of Tultera on farmland. The stock-proof attributes give it its weed-like ability to colonise poor pasture areas. There's a good correlation between steep slopes, poor pasture species, and the establishment of Tultera. Birds spread the seed out from existing stands, and grazing even helps with seedling establishment. Dense thickets occur within paddocks, up to 60,000 stems per hectare. Saplings develop into dense pole stands where competition is so fierce that growth slows to millimetres per annum. The natural pole stands develop on and self-thinning occurs. And eventually, we end up with middle-sized trees on what was previously cleared land. So it's not a case of planting and waiting 80 years. In theory, some sustainable regional production could even start now. This is not remnant forest, it's second growth forest. We can conceptualise this as a unique native forest type. It is highly modified, but it is capable of sustainable management. We're calling this farm Tultera. Tultera responds very well to pruning and to thinning. This is a naturally regenerated pole stand that had a stocking of 2,800 stems per hectare, which we've reduced to 700 stems per hectare, according to one of the thinning schedules that we've developed. Our silviculture trials started in 2007, and they've proven that growth rates can be significantly increased through management, up to a 6-fold increase in productivity on some sites. You can see how narrow the growth rings were on this stem before thinning. The last 4 years of growth showed rapidly increasing growth rings. But it's not all about timber production. Our Tultera and Riparian Management Project linked to the productive management of Tultera on a dairy farm runoff with enhanced biodiversity and water quality values. However, these natural stands often have a monocultural character due to the past influence of grazing. And even when livestock are excluded, the shade and the competition can be so fierce that there's often very little understory development. But thinning and pruning, it's the light and an understory develops. And where stock are excluded, diverse native hardwoods and ground colours and a substory develops. And later, through harvesting, hardwoods like puriri, tarairi, towai, koikoi, they all get a chance to then get into the canopy and join the forest canopy. So paradoxically, transitioning what is a modified Tultera dominant forest type into a more natural and diverse forest with a more replete array of species will require deliberate and active intervention, and in this respect, an appropriate harvesting has a role to play. Tultera often create a natural mosaic pattern in the landscape by occupying the gullies, the steep slopes, and the riparian margins, particularly in pastoral environments. And I see potential for this to become a far more extensive web of native forest, occupying the most sensitive areas of the landscape and becoming like the connective grout between a mosaic pattern, a local vegetative matrix within which other land uses can be nestled, a filter to our waterways and our harbours. And certainly our studies have shown that management of such areas for timber production is compatible with biodiversity and water quality enhancement. But there are not just environmental benefits, there are also social and cultural benefits. And working in native forest develops a connection to it. It makes it relevant and it makes it meaningful to people. And particularly for young people, I suggest a look but don't touch relationship to native forest is pretty unengaging. These young men couldn't confidently identify a Tultera at the start of the day, but they sure could by the end of it, and they had a sense of accomplishment and a stack of Tultera posts for their project. Now it's possible to legally harvest native trees under the provisions of the Forests Act, but this requires harvesting to be done on a sustainable basis. However, the Act is very difficult to apply to farm Tultera. It's very costly and it's very time consuming. And along with other regulatory controls, including district plans, it is a significant disincentive and impediment for landowners. Nevertheless, we have applied the Act and we have sustainably harvested over 300 cubic metres of Tultera from 3 different farms as part of a project. Karakia by Mana Whenua preceded all the harvests in the Tultera industry pilot. And we've demonstrated low impact harvesting that applies continuous cover forestry practices. There's no clear felling, this is single stem selection and extraction. Machinery never needed to enter the forest. Trees could either be felled out towards the paddocks or winched from the edge of the stands. And harvest can often be used as a stand improvement tool. That's removing the shorter, fatter, bold trees and leaving the taller, better formed trees to grow on. As in this example, now the growth will go on the better, taller trees. Best practice is to leave the best trees standing. This is culling rather than creaming the forest. And that means taking a high proportion of trees with poorer log grades now, but creating a better forest for the future generations. Sustainable forest management requires long-term intergenerational thinking. And this picture shows a contrast between our Tultera harvest using continuous cover forestry principles in the foreground and a clear fell pine operation in the background. They're vastly different impacts on the landscape. The mean age of the trees we harvested was 83 years, and the mean diameter was 50 centimetres breast height. And this is from untended natural stands. Managed stands could be significantly more productive. Farm Tultera is easy to mill, easy to dry, and it has excellent timber properties. While the young trees don't have the same content of durable heartwood like the old growth trees, Tultera sapwood is still an excellent finewood timber, softwood timber, and it's suitable for many interior uses without any treatment. And we've found that farm Tultera has been widely used, from everything from stockyards to the kitchen sink, even a log house. And here are some examples. Fine art and craftsmanship, flooring, kitchens, cabinetry, and of course Tultera was and still is revered by Maori and is a very important part of our cultural heritage. Even young Tultera carves well and is in demand. Excitingly, the Tultera Industry Pilot Project has determined that there is a business case for a regional industry to be based on the sustainable management of this naturally regenerated resource developing in Te Tai Tokerau on private land and on Maori land. And we believe that there's the potential to create a model of how primary industry should be, an appropriate enterprise for the 21st century, a nature-based regenerative forestry model for Aotearoa. And regenerative not just in regard to environmental outcomes, but also socially and culturally as part of the whole package. And so I'm thrilled that Te Tai Tokerau Māori Forestry Incorporated have indicated a willingness to try and take this research project to industry startup. However, there are still significant challenges and even impediments that frustrate this vision and stall the progress. These include public perceptions, legal and regulatory impediments, severe market failures and disincentives, such as the emissions trading scheme, which incentivises exotic plantation forestry rather than establishment of permanent native forests. So this is where enabling and facilitating the most appropriate land use requires a very proactive re-engineering of our human systems to better fit and to better work with nature. A complete and functioning supply chain needs to be set up, and this is a massive task that requires government support and impact investors who are looking for positive environmental and social outcomes rather than short-term profit. And this brings me back to an important question. Why on earth are we putting so much effort into promoting the commercial use of this native tree species and native forests generally? How can it possibly be a good thing, cutting down native trees? Well, for me, Morgan Williams, the former Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, he really distilled the matter. He said, commodity markets are the biggest drivers and shapers of our private rural lands. It's markets that determine our land use choices and our land use changes, what we grow, how we grow it. And pine trees and dairy cows are good evidence for this. We think of bush to pasture, pasture to pines, pines back into dairy farming, farms into lifestyle blocks. These are all massive landscape transformations that are really driven by markets. So I suggest to you that markets are actually the most creative force in rural landscapes. It's not district plans or landscape assessments, which tend to be more reactive. Morgan Williams highlighted the challenge. How do we get markets to shape things for the better? And this is the premise that supports using timber and carbon and perhaps payment for ecosystem services as vehicles to incentivise native forestry as a viable land use option. If we want to see more native forests woven back into our working lands, and to see it at anything more than a token scale, and to see it well managed, then we need to find ways to work with and incentivise native forest cover to become a viable, income-producing land use option. This has been the story of the Northland Tultera Working Group. It's been one effort to try and address that call from Morgan Williams. trying to create the interwoven world David Hall talks about. For me, this has been a 20-year journey, and it's been extremely satisfying, because I believe it could be extremely effective in weaving more native forest back into our working lands. And I feel this has been a form of landscape architecture, but I guess technically it's landscape ecology. And I've interpreted the theme of this conference, radical reorientation, as potentially a radical reorientation of the profession. I think it's pretty clear which direction I've been looking. Kia ora tātou. Thank you for listening.